My name is Mark Searcy, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Science. Thank you all for joining us for our 5th inaugural lecture of the spring term. It's great to be here this evening. Welcome to those of you who are here in the Thomas Paine Study Centre, and also to those of you joining us via YouTube. Thank you for taking part, and please do let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I'd also like to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Irene Lorenzoni.
Thank you.
Irene is an environmental social scientist with an interest in how we, as human beings, perceive and understand environmental shifts, what we do or don't do about these, and why. Her current research focuses on how individuals and groups in society perceive, understand, and respond to change. This includes their views of change, agency, and capacity for action. Most of her work focuses specifically on climate change, and key topics of her work include societal transformations and low-carbon futures, governance of decarbonisation, communication of and accessibility of climate data in visual form, and coastal adaptation and resilience. Her approach is mostly multidisciplinary and fosters interdisciplinary collaborations. Irene is part of there's going to be a lot of acronyms now, is part of the ESRC-funded Centre CAST, which stands for Climate Change and Social Transformation, and Deep Decarb Project, the democratic challenge of navigating governance traps. She serves on the editorial board of the academic journal Wiley Interdisciplinary Reviews Climate Change, and is also a member of the Science, Society and Sustainability 3S research group at UEA. We love acronyms at UEA. And of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Irene Lorenzoni to give her inaugural lecture.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Okay, great. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. Welcome, everyone. I am really honored that you've taken the time to come today in person or that you're online wishing to attend this talk today. So just a little bit of background, in addition to what Mark has just said, I consider myself to be an environmental social scientist, and I'm very much interested in environmental change and how we perceive that. And most of my work has been focused around climate change. So I'm very fortunate to work with a huge team of different colleagues, mostly in the School of Environmental Sciences, but also elsewhere, that have supported me and guided me and provided me with advice as well throughout the 2 decades or so that I've really been looking at this topic. So my interest in climate change very much blossomed with my PhD, which was focused around that. It was very much a study of how climate change was perceived in 2 different locations in the UK and in Italy. And since then, I've really taken forward a lot of interdisciplinary work. So that very much draws upon psychology, political sciences, and it very much uses social science methods to try and understand how we think and how we respond to environmental change. So things like interviews and surveys. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background to this because that helps you understand where I'm coming from and the fact that although the title has climate change in it, I'm going to be using very little science around climate change and much more around how individuals and societies relate to this issue. So to start off with, we felt that it would be really nice to just think really for a moment about what climate change means to us. It's an issue that's in the media a lot, which we reflect upon in our day-to-day lives, I think, and of course, which is the focus of my work. And I would say that it's important to consider this also in relation to the fact that there are multiple definitions and multiple ways in which we can think about climate change. Now, one definition that we often see around, or reference to climate change that we often see around, is the one used by the IPCC. That's the UN government agency that explores and reviews the science around climate change. They refer to climate change as a change in the long-term climate that's induced by human contributions, such as emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and land use, but it also is partly ascribable to natural change. So in whichever way you think about climate change, I think just having a little bit of an understanding of how this is related to in relation to the science is really quite helpful. And since 2007, reviews of the climate science have indicated that it's unequivocal that climate change is happening. And then very recently, in the 2001 reviews of the IPCC, that it's unequivocal that human beings have an impact on the climate. So in terms of thinking about what that means, for me personally, I often associate climate change to change in the conditions in which I live. It changes to the natural world, but changes in localities that I frequent and that I enjoy being in. So if we think about climate change as a change that's partly human-induced, then the understanding and the consensus of the science is that climate change has been exacerbated since the times of the Industrial Revolution by increases in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And if this continues over time, then projections are that climate change will continue to occur, and that some of those changes to the natural environment and to our day-to-day living will continue to be exacerbated by climate change. So there are options about what we can do in relation to that, and we can reduce our emissions. So this is what's called mitigation of climate change. But also, we need to be aware of the fact that climate change will continue to occur. That will cause particular changes to our environments. It will create impacts on our day-to-day living. So there are these two notions that the scientists distinguish, mitigation and adaptation. But for a lot of people in their day-to-day lives, these are actually meshed together and quite closely related. So why is this relevant? If we're thinking about actions on climate change, so mitigation and adaptation, and we feel that actually human contributions are changing the climate, then it can be viewed as a collective action problem. So as an issue that potentially involves all different players in society in order to try and contribute to resolving some of the issues that are at stake. So this is a graphic that I've put together. It's quite simplistic, but it helps us understand the potential relationships that might exist between these different actors and the contribution that they make to climate change, but potential also the role they play in helping to provide a solution or a set of solutions towards them. So what I'd like to focus on initially in my talk is around the bottom part of this graph, which you can see here, that relates to individuals and citizens. But then eventually I'd like to also move up to thinking about other key players here, including governments and other interest groups, charities, and so on. So what I'd like to do is also then summarize for you in a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour some of the key elements of my research that have contributed to understanding these issues over time, and point out then some important implications of that research as well. So at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a lot of work being undertaken, mainly in Europe, in the UK, and in North America, to try and understand what issues were emerging around the management of climate change. And some of the work that a colleague, Tom Lowe, and I did at the time was to interview individuals who were involved in research in policy making and in policy advice around potentially what dangerous climate change means and how that can be managed. The reason we focused on danger in relation to climate change is because the second article of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which oversees international agreements around climate change, focuses very much on the objective to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. So we asked individuals to think about this. We asked them to draw some of their ideas around issues that related to each other. Then we brought all these components together, if you like, in a kind of meta-mental model of what our interviewees had told us about. And here I've simplified one of the depictions of this mental model. And I think it quite neatly illustrates for us what the key challenges are still in relation to addressing climate change and what they were at the time, around 2006, when we did this work. Now, most of the interviewees are from the UK, from other parts of Europe as well, and it very much reflects some of that focus of my research, which is around those geographical areas. Even today, there is a paucity of work around the social aspects of climate change in other parts of the world. So that is very much an element, I would say, that really needs to be raised and brought to the fore, and research continued in this area as well. So if we look at this diagram, in the center, there's very much this notion around impact on the climate through changes in greenhouse gas emissions and therefore concentrations. That can lead to impacts around on all aspects of life on Earth, and adaptation is potentially the option of being able to cope and potentially become more resilient to those impacts. But interestingly, our respondents also focused very much on what we see on the left-hand side of the graph here, which is that we can take action through reducing those emissions, through changes in land use, and that can result in mitigation, but also that there is a strong resistance to changing those very bases that create the issues around climate change in the first place. And that therefore there is a kind of reluctance, if you like, or a perceived threat to the status quo in terms of taking action. And that is very much something that is still present today and is an issue that we'll then look at in a little bit more detail as this talk progresses. But in relation then to thinking about what aspects need to be considered around dealing with climate change, some of the issues that the respondents came up with were very much aspects that relate to society. They very much said we need to think about how people perceive and understand the problem, what kind of constraints there might be to taking action, what kind of options might be facilitated and rendered more feasible if the uptake of those actions is to take place. The kind of also reluctance in terms of taking action because of a variety of other societal aspects. And so this was really important in providing a really good overview of what the situation was. And this very much reflected some of the work that was going on at the time, also in understanding some of these limitations. So I'd like to then try and raise some questions, which again another colleague and I explored in a paper in 2006, in terms of thinking of why is it important then to understand what people think and perceive about climate change. So we could argue that potentially successful implementation of policies and decisions around climate change can be affected by the very views of those who might need to implement those decisions and who in turn will be affected by those decisions themselves. So that is the case for most policies around climate change. If they demand some kind of reorganization of our day-to-day lives, then we might be more or less interested in supporting those policies. Also, in terms of communication about risks in relation to climate change, There's been an argument made that if policymakers, for example, present ideas or present solutions around climate change that contrast with the way that individuals are thinking about them, there can be a disconnect in relation to how risk could be managed. And if policies around climate change are misunderstood or potentially neglected or even opposed by publics, then what option is there in terms of taking action around the problem? So it's important then to try and consider how is it then perhaps that we might understand climate change. So in 2005, 2006, again, some colleagues and I brought together some work that we had undertaken in relation to trying to understand what kind of associations people had with climate change. And this was based on 2 surveys, one undertaken in the USA, one in Great Britain, in which we asked in similar kinds of ways, but not exactly the same, what 3 images come to mind when you think about climate change, global warming in the case of the US, and are these a good or a bad thing? So what kind of valence, if you like, or what kind of emotional connection might be made with particular images that people were suggesting? And you can see here, I've tried to depict the ones that were most frequently mentioned by respondents in the US and in Britain. You can see these side by side. And quite interestingly, they are actually really quite different. In the US, the top one that was referred to was in relation to melting ice. At the time, there was a lot of talk in newspapers around glaciers melting, effect on polar ice caps, and so on. The other one that was also most frequently mentioned was heat, followed by impacts on the natural environment, ozone, which is quite an interesting one, and then kind of disaster or negative consequences overall. And you can see that in common, in the British set of the top 5 most frequently mentioned images, you can see ozone as well. And this is quite an interesting connection that was made very much in the public discourse around changes to the climate and ozone depletion. At the time, there was a very vivid public imagery around the ozone hole as a hole in the Earth's shield being affected by particular chemicals, and that got entwined quite closely with these ideas of climate change and global warming. The Great Britain images are quite different. They're mostly around weather, global warming, which is sometimes thought of as a synonym for climate change, changing climate, and then lots and lots of other different images. But I think what you might find noticeable here is that there's little reference, apart from perhaps in the US list, to particular impacts or quite specific impacts, although some of those did get mentioned, but less frequently by respondents, and to potential solutions or options for doing something. And the connotations with all of these images that people mentioned were negative. So people were associating climate change and global warming with negativity, negative elements. So there's been a lot of work, especially at the beginning of the 2000s, trying to understand how it is that people were conceptualizing this issue. What was the problem? What were people thinking about it? And how, therefore, might communication around the issue itself be developed to connect with the way that people were thinking about it, and then potential solutions put forward. Some of these images around climate change are very much pertinent today. There's a lot of publicity in various different public spheres like media and so on that very much talk about these elements as well. Although that over time has also ranged much more into thinking about what potential solutions there might be. So this is relevant because it helps us to think about how communication around climate change might occur and which are the key factors or key potential associations that we might make with these particular issues. So a lot of my work also around that time with Nick Pigeon and other colleagues was around more general public perceptions around climate change. And we did a review of lots of different studies that looked at this around 2006. And what was evident was that there was already quite widespread concern about climate change. Most countries around Europe, certainly North America and the UK. And this is very much reflected still today. In fact, concern and worry around climate change has gone up. And there is even quite a lot of presence around climate anxiety. And that's been picked up by a lot of the social science work around climate change. But at the time, it was also evident that climate change had lower salience than other issues. So climate change tended to be there in the public mind, if you like, but there were other aspects that were much more important. And some of the survey work that is currently being done and more recently being done also point to some of these elements. It was also obvious from some of the work that actually if people felt that they were voluntarily taking risks, then those risks became more acceptable to them. And that they also partly felt then that if a risk was taken voluntarily, they also had a greater agency. So they had also a greater ability to take control of that risk and do something about it. Climate change, though, was considered one of these kind of in-between risks, if you like. One of these risks that was occurring, that we as individuals were contributing to, that we could partly address through our own individual action. But most individuals also seem to think that actually most of our own actions on climate change would not be very effective. And there was also a reticence in some cases to change behaviors for reducing our impact on the environment. Some of that was related to the fact that people felt that they were already locked in to particular lifestyles, particular ways of doing things, and that was also being demanded by the system, if you like, or the society and their choices. There was also the recognition that climate change, being a collective problem, also demanded a collective solution, and that therefore all people in society, all groups in society, all players in society should take some responsibility for addressing it. And therefore it's a collective action problem, but also with diffuse responsibility. So there was a key element already emerging in some of this research, which was around the trust in institutions that could effectively take action on climate change. And therefore the importance of that action by political actors in order to demonstrate that they could do something, that it could be done effectively, and that therefore it instilled trust in them, and that in turn would hopefully encourage individuals also to take actions themselves. At the time also, there was a lot of discussion around how climate change could be addressed by different technologies. And how that could relate to both mitigation, for example, nuclear power and energy security, but also around adaptation. So which kind of technological options might be available to adapt to the impacts of climate change? So things like, for example, particular sea defenses in some locations, better communication tools in other cases, and so on. So that was really important because at the time there was, specifically in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, a really big discussion happening around the benefits of taking action now rather than delaying action in the future around climate change. And the economic costs that delaying action would imply. So what we then tried to do is to understand what those barriers, if you like, or constraints were to people taking action around climate change. And we brought together 3 different studies that had been undertaken in the UK, and we explored then from an individual and a social perspective what constraints, or barriers there were to engaging with climate change. And we very much conceptualized engaging with climate change as something that could be done at a reasoned level, so at a cognitive level, something that could be done in relation to emotions, so some people would engage with climate change in an emotive manner, but also something that could be done in relation to behaviors or taking action. And this was quite an important paper in terms of the impact it had on understanding the subject much more widely. So you can see here that the kind of barriers at an individual level to engaging with climate change are those that I've put in these little blue bubbles. The ones that are more socially focused are in these orange bubbles. And I think that if we all look at those, we potentially identify with some of those already. And very interestingly, I would argue, quite a lot of the work that also is coming out now identifies these barriers still in relation to engaging with climate change and potentially taking action. Some of these elements that perhaps have changed a little bit over time are the aspects around knowledge, perhaps uncertainty, because the climate science has moved on quite a lot. But I think, again, with the rise in social media and the exchange of information that exists in various different forms and various different formats, that understanding and of climate change, but also the kind of various discourses that exist around that, have fueled very different perspectives around this issue in itself. Also, something that was really prominent at the time of this research was that climate change was viewed very much as a distant threat, as something that was happening, but something that was quite removed in space and time from people, mainly in the countries where we did our work, certainly in the UK. And that's actually changed quite a lot. If you look at other work in the social sciences, climate change is much more here and now. There is a view that, yes, it is occurring. It's sometimes experienced in relation to perhaps unusual weather patterns or particularly different series of events, such as drought sometimes or flooding and so on. But that in itself is still enshrouded in quite a lot of different ways in which individuals think about climate change. And not everybody subscribes to this idea that it is potentially human-induced and that some of the impacts that we're witnessing now are related to it. So if these are the barriers to engaging in climate change, then what else can be done about it? What does this mean in relation to then thinking about taking action on climate change? Well, these notions that actually individuals are very much part of groups in society, that they are enabled, but also partly constrained in taking action in relation to the world that they live in, is very much an image that we still retain today. And this reflects, I think, some of those societal contexts, personal contexts, and structural contexts that we saw expressed in those barriers that I illustrated earlier. And I think that, for example, this graphic that comes from the United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap Report of 3 years ago really tries to emphasize how it is that people and individuals, such as myself, try and relate to the context in which we operate in order to make choices about those particular actions that we might decide to undertake. And sometimes we're hampered in our ability to do something that's effective for the purposes that we might want to take forward. So a lot of work nowadays shows that individuals generally, although they're concerned and worried about climate change, also are willing to take action. Despite, for example, the climate crisis, they support technological solutions to climate change. But there is still this uncertainty about which actions might be most effective and which ones are potentially within individuals' reach and capacity to implement. So we spoke about technological solutions, and that is also part of that discourse, that kind of conversation that exists around climate change. So based on the work that we did around 2006 and 2007, we thought, oh, okay, there's quite a lot being offered by policymakers in relation to thinking about energy options that might be different in the future and how that can help towards mitigating climate change. But we did some work around thinking about potential acceptance of different technologies. And there was some qualitative work that colleagues did, some more quantitative work using questionnaires, for example. And one of the elements that we looked at in more detail was this notion of nuclear power. How is it that individuals and people might think of nuclear power in and of itself? And would they be prepared to perhaps more greatly accept nuclear energy if that was an option that would help mitigate climate change itself? And perhaps not surprisingly, it was a very interesting set of findings that we saw in some of the work that we did. People were actually very much interested in expressing the complexity that they saw around having to think of different options into the future. They had quite elaborate understandings of the kinds of futures that they wanted, but also the role that different energy options might play in those futures. And the initial kind of approach was that actually we don't want to trade off the option of having nuclear power versus the option of reducing our impact on the climate. It's not as simple as trading off these two different risks. And so for a lot of people, they were just saying, well, okay, if we need to mitigate climate change into the future, maybe we'll kind of reluctantly accept this role that nuclear power has to play, but actually we would prefer a very different suite of options, including much more sustainable ones, like renewable energy, and so on. And it's quite interesting to see that these complex ideas of what it is that desirable futures might be, but also thinking about why those components are important to relate to in different ways, emerges still in much more recent work that we've been undertaking as well. So, for example, again, some of my colleagues who are here today and I did a little bit of work around greenhouse gas removal. This notion that, again, in order to mitigate climate change, maybe removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere might be another option to be considered. And in fact, in some projections of climate change in the future, there is a suggestion that maybe some of these technologically driven options might be important. But it's also some of those societal aspects of thinking about the complexity of futures that we want, the visions of futures that we might desire, and the more sustainable aspects of those and how they relate to each other are usually underrepresented in some of these models that are used. And so focusing on different options, thinking in much more open spaces in which discussion can happen about which opportunities might be available for the future and how these affect decision making is also really important. So I've talked quite a lot about the work that we've been doing in relation to mitigation of climate change. But I think that a real important element is also thinking about adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So this is thinking about changes that are occurring, will occur, due to the onset of climate change. And we've done quite a lot of work over the years in thinking about this in different ways. We've looked at the impact of heat waves and responses by elderly people. We've looked at the impact of flooding in different localities, the responses of local residents to those threats. And we've also looked at coastal erosion and the potential exacerbation of that through climate change in the future. And what is relevant here is that we're thinking of some of these situations that have occurred as a potential way of trying to imagine what might also be occurring in the future in terms of those impacts because of the onset of climate change in the longer term. And those impacts don't always represent negative outcomes. They can also represent opportunities. But what's really emerged very strongly from the work that we've done is that climate change can be seen as a threat to identity of individuals living in particular locations, to the places that they are very strongly attached to, that they use in their day-to-day lives, and that they would like to sometimes retain certain aspects or characteristics of. And sometimes the options that are offered in terms of adapting to the impacts of climate change and the potential solutions as well are quite limited. Sometimes it's a case of, well, let's try to cope with the changes that are occurring. Let's try to see how we can perhaps change a little bit in order to adjust to those changes that are occurring. Or perhaps we can try and modify a little bit the options that we have, like perhaps build a wall to prevent some flooding in one particular occasion with perhaps a little bit of discussion around how that wall might be organized or what kind of elements it might contain. So often what we see is being questioned is actually what kind of benefits might adapting to climate change bring. Because it often means that most people in the current present time won't really see many of those benefits. Sometimes they also argue that the benefits adapting to climate change usually occur later on in time and maybe might relate to other people in other localities. And there's also a question of really whether it's effective to adapt in the way that's recommended. So some of the work we did with elderly people, they felt that they could quite easily take precautions and they would be fine during hot weather events. And that they had people that could potentially help them out if they needed that help. But what we found was that often their social networks didn't really know what to do. They were being relied upon, but they weren't equipped in order to help these people out. Often also, more elderly people said that they felt they were fine. They were not vulnerable. I remember one person said that they felt like a 13-year-old in an 80-year-old body. And so therefore, their perception and their understanding of what they could do didn't tally with the situation that they were living in. Also, what we found was that on occasions, people felt a bit disappointed when the help and assistance that they wanted did not materialize. So we saw that in some of the flooding work that we did. And the response then that people put together was very different. In places where they felt that agencies and authorities that were responsible for flooding had in the past acted fairly and had tried to do as much as they could, led to people taking more action voluntarily and willingly to help themselves and to help others. And that in turn also affected their perception of future risk and being able to deal with that. So the kind of agreement, perhaps implicit, that exists between different players in society and how to deal with the impacts of climate change is really important. It's what some people call the social contract. So the idea that actually if people feel that actions are taken fairly and that there's some kind of mutual agreement on how that is to occur, then generally that's related to positive outlooks and also to societal well-being. Also, there's, I think, a really big question on how future adaptation can be planned for. So there are some innovative projects going on at the moment. There is, for example, the Backton to Walcott Coastal Management Scheme, which we have here on our doorstep. That involves using a solution that's much more nature-based in order to try and slow down erosion on the coastline by putting on a lot of sand on the beaches at a particular location and waiting for the sea to take action and to, but allowing protection for particular areas over a certain amount of time. So that might reduce some of those kind of worries that might exist around how people might deal with an eroding coastline and living there for some time. But it is very different. It's very unusual. There's still questions around the effectiveness of those options and really how people might feel about them over a longer period of time. And also about the fairness of those options. Who is it that potentially gets protected? Who is it that gets given an opportunity to adapt? And where that might occur in the future? Who might benefit in the future? And who's benefiting from that now? Okay, and so we go back to the schema that I had before, but now I've added another couple of bubbles, and we're moving to considering these aspects around players that are higher up on the screen that you can see here. So obviously the government, for example, and other related agencies don't operate in isolation. There are lots of other elements occurring at international scales that influence their actions and the options that they have available in relation to taking action on climate change. And also there's an important role for some national advisory bodies as well. So I'd like to briefly mention some of the work that we've done recently. We've talked a bit about the communication of climate science. And some of the work that Jordan Harold and I have done with other colleagues as well is thinking about how can climate science be communicated perhaps in a different way in order to be understood, but also to be much more accessible to a variety of different actors in society. And that is thinking about the role that climate science has in relation to the understanding of climate change, but also then the connection and the engagement that might result as a consequence of that. And we've done quite a lot of work around visuals, such as graphs and other kind of imagery around climate change. And what some of the work that we've done has shown is that images that are really quite complex are also more difficult to understand. So what we've put together is a set of guidelines of how accessibility of climate change data can be improved through key ways and key principles stemming from the cognitive sciences. And some of our work has been incorporated into the way that the IPCC communicates. And the IPCC itself, in some of its more recent reports, has included a much more iterative process in which designers can advise authors of their reports around how to represent some of this visual imagery. It's tested out with the people that will use these reports in an ongoing cycle in order to improve the way that climate science is communicated. And some of that work has also fed into the more recent report of the IPCC published a couple of years ago. And also, we've been doing a little bit of work around how advice on policy is communicated to government. A lot of governments have advisory bodies that are usually mandated with providing recommendations on what they should be doing, and they scrutinize the work of governments. How do they provide this advice? Does it change over time? So again, some work that colleagues and I have done is focused around the UK Climate Change Committee, which is the UK's advisory body on climate change, and looking at the recommendations that they have published over just over a decade, shows that sometimes they don't follow a particular format. There has been a lot of variation year on year. They're repeated over time. And sometimes they don't necessarily challenge some of the existing situation, although that has changed significantly. So it really raises questions of how we understand that communication and that interaction of engagement with climate change. And longitudinal work is difficult to do, but it's important in this situation. We have multiple ways of thinking about it, multiple more interdisciplinary ways of thinking about these elements as well that can help shed new insights and light into what's occurring. And then it causes and raises questions around what might be improved, what can be done next in terms of how this advice is provided. And so I think then that amongst existing challenges that we're now trying to understand with the work that we're undertaking, there's a question here then of thinking about that diagram again with all those multiple actors involved. So you might know of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement calls for all nations around the world to really take action on climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. It argues that we should try and keep temperature rises to below 2 degrees centigrade, and hopefully 1 degree centigrade. So that involves actually everybody taking action and interacting in ways that this action is productive and significant in relation to climate change. But if that is studied independently, like we said, the discipline of psychology can offer lots of insights into what we understand individuals respond to, how we can frame communications, but it doesn't really tell us about politics, or the political sciences can't really always help us understand what's happening in relation to individual communication around climate change. So it poses quite a challenge in relation to thinking about where does the problem lie? Do we have different perspectives around the issue of climate change? And are there different ways that we can think about these possible solutions? So there's a call here for trying to bring together quite a lot of this understanding that at the moment consists and is available in lots of different areas, and really kind of try and tie together in order to think about the relationships and the workings of those different actors together. So going back to what we said, what does climate change mean to you? Hopefully, it's perhaps a little bit more insightful, or what I've provided is a little bit more of an insight into what has been done so far, but also what some of those potential opportunities are. So climate change is something that we live with now, we will continue to live with in the future, but we have the opportunities of really meaningfully address it. And hopefully I've provided some insights into some of these ways that we can think about it going forward. So I'd like to say thank you very much again to everybody. Here's a list of references if anybody's interested. And thank you to all my colleagues, collaborators, and funders, and everybody yes, that I've worked before and that supported me so far. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
So thank you, Irene. That was an amazing run-through of why our perceptions of climate change was as important as in society as climate change itself and the way people perceive things. It made me reflect on a conversation I had with my 86-year-old mother on the phone the other day where she said, but climate's always changing, isn't it, Mum? And I had
Yep.
a 10-minute rant at her over the FaceTime of how, I work at the university that researches into climate change, and it's really important that we understand this. And I got to the end of my 10-minute rant, and she said, "That's not really how you're supposed to talk to your mother, Mark." But it is amazing to see as well the way that the things that you do range from Pacton Sands to the Paris Agreement to the IPCC, and it really is a global issue, and the way that we perceive climate change is incredibly important. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For that. I'm sure Irene would be very pleased to answer any questions that you might have for a few minutes. There are some, or there should be, a microphone around. So if you want to ask a question, could you wait for the microphone so that the people who are online can also hear what the questions are? So does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Jackie. Jenny.
Thank you for a wonderful and splendid talk, Irene. I'm really interested in this tension between kind of policy-led change and then kind of bottom-up citizen-led change. And I just wondered, from some of the contrasts that you're doing working across Europe and the US, do you see contrasts in how people take action according to whether they're operating within a political system where pro-social behaviour is rewarded through governance, or where, for example, antisocial behaviour is seen as, where I think of that related to climate change as things that are having a bad impact on the environment, where people are kind of looked down on for that versus kind of continuous growth and destruction.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And actually, I was at Norwich Science Festival event a week and a bit ago, and there was a similar question that was posed to us. And I think one of the elements that we discussed, and that's actually been discussed, is how much people can be motivated to do something, and how that works kind of psychologically. So actually quite a lot of more recent work has shown that people generally feel more motivated to do something when they see that their actions are already having an effect and that there is a positive outcome, quite visible and accessible to them. So that can be a way of framing, if you like, and of presenting potential solutions and motivating people to take action about them. But here in the UK, we find that still quite a lot of people feel that although they have a responsibility for doing something about it, they're also waiting for others to do something about it. And some recent work by colleagues in Cardiff, for example, showed that that's actually very difficult to other particular extreme situations that we've been in, for example, COVID more recently. So because I think of the collective action issue around climate change, there's almost a kind of debate between thinking, well, I need to take action, and I can within certain spheres of my own influence and where I see that I can be quite effective in having a meaningful impact. But in other cases, I feel quite bound by the system or the kind of situation that I'm in. I've seen quite a lot of work in the US where people that have been affected by extreme events have had a greater propensity to then take action later on, sometimes because of that very personal impact that that has had. But also in the US, there's much more of a partisan nature, a politically partisan nature to thinking about climate change as human-induced and therefore to take action around that. So that's a different, if you like, political outlook than it exists here. But that is also changing quite a lot through time. And we can see that some of the similarities are becoming closer. Yeah, so that's quite curious. Oh, Andre.
Thank you, Irene. Partly a follow-up to that question. We've now got a new government department of net zero, which has all sorts of challenges. Given all the research you've done and what you've said, if you had the ability to sort of set the government agenda to try and address net zero, what do you think are the real priorities that government should be in the UK should be trying to do?
Well, that's a tall order. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion, and the Climate Change Committee in the UK has recommended to government many times over that they take a much more concerted approach to mitigating climate change. So we're thinking about mitigation now as opposed to adaptation. And it's been shown that behavior change can have a really big impact in all sorts of areas around mitigating climate change. So my personal view on that would be that actually I think a lot of the kind of more technologically oriented options that are being discussed and, that are being considered at government level should be opened up for discussion. Around the effect that they might have on actually reducing emissions, how long that might take, where they might be situated or how they might take place, and how they relate to other options that might be much more feasible at a local scale and that people might want to put forward themselves. Because I think from a lot of work that we've done within the school and that has been done much more widely, I think there's a certain amount of uncertainty and a certain amount of resistance to these kind of top-down options, and sometimes options that haven't been fully tested through or fully thought through. So I would say that actually there needs to be more discussion around that, but I think also more kind of indication of which options might be relatively acceptable and where, and a kind of clear idea of where it is that we might be going in the future. Because something that's been talked a lot about is, well, we've done the relatively easy things, like managed to decarbonize some of our energy sector and so on, but some of the really hard options are still there to be thought through. And this is a bit of an impasse that's existing at the moment. And much of the government option, or many of the government options are technologically led. And there's very little discussion here of how people might take some of these up, whether people might actually want to, or whether you might see a very different vision of the future under net zero. And also to think through what that might imply, because I think sometimes for us, thinking about living in a net zero world is actually quite difficult to conceptualize. And there have been studies in, for example, the Scandinavian countries, including Norway, of setting up little demonstration projects saying, if these are the options we put together, this is what your life might look like in the future. And that might create perhaps a more tangible vision of what that might be, which could be really helpful as well.
Well, thanks very much, Irene. I was just wondering what your data says about, because you mentioned about a reluctance from the proletariat. I just wondered what your data said about the action that might be taken by the governments and might be taken about the ordinary or from the ordinary person. What is your data saying about what people are actually wanting to do? Are they waiting for governments to do things, or are they actually taking action themselves?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work, and we have colleagues again in other locations that do survey work. Quite a lot of qualitative work has shown that people indicate a willingness to take action around climate change. And there are options that people are doing, things like reducing their emissions from diets, for example, on occasions, installing different technologies in their homes and so on. I think it's difficult to understand now what the situation is in quite a lot of detail, although studies are emerging, because of course with the cost of living crisis and the energy situation that we have, reduction in energy use, for example, has gone down quite substantially, but that has also been driven by other elements and not specifically thoughts and kind of implications of climate change. So there is an indication that people are willing to take action, but people don't always take action that is most effective. So there could be things that people might be able to do and that would reduce emissions much more than other elements that they're undertaking. And part of that is due to personal choice or personal capacity to be able to do something. I think that there are certain options that people might want to take forward, but that they see they are limited in terms of the opportunities they have. So in work that I've done previously, sometimes people say, well, I would take public transport if I could get from A to B quite easily, but I have to take 4 different routes in order to get there. So that doesn't make it easy for me. I don't have the time. I'm constrained by other elements in my day-to-day life. So that combination of being facilitated and enabled in undertaking that change is something that often comes up in those kind of discussions around what it means to be able to be much more proactive and take control and being able to effectively undertake those actions in relation to a problem like climate change.
Oh, it's one more. We'll take one more question just down here.
Yeah, thanks very much. It got me thinking, because one problem I think is that the requirement for people to change their views and their actions and behaviour is that they have to think differently, and that's quite a profound thing. People are used to thinking ethically about things that don't directly concern them. But to think in a relatively abstract way, but to think about the future and the planet, I think that it needs to expand the horizon of the ethical horizon to include care for the earth, care for the planet. And that can be quite a difficult step to make. And it's not always helped by rhetoric of a kind of apocalyptic nature. Do you think that schools and education, because I'm in the School of Education, do you think they're doing enough at the moment to alter the way in which people think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I would give 2 replies to that. One of them is that action can be facilitated also the other way around. Sometimes things can be enacted and that will encourage behavior change. So the 5p plastic bag charge is a very classic example that's used of imposing that and then people suddenly reducing the amount of plastic bags that they took. And that behavior then becoming instilled and becoming more of an acceptable social norm. In terms of education, I think from my personal experience and for having spoken to other people who are in education, those elements around climate change are being increasingly taught in school. They are, I think, filtering through the younger groups in society. We obviously have seen the Fridays for Future strikes and much younger people demanding, that politicians enact the change that they would like to see. So I think it's filtering through, but I think the kind of constraints, if you like, or those kind of threats to the status quo, I think are still very, very dominant. And I would say that that those are very noticeable still in the way that we think about the combination of those in our society, in the way that we're driven by them. But again, it would be very interesting to look and do some more work around these elements, I would say, in other parts of the world. And I think that slowly some of that thinking is changing. But from my personal point of view, I think it's still quite shallow, not very pervasive and not deep enough in order to instigate change.
Okay, well, thank you
Thank you.
again, Irene.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite you to join us outside for there are some drinks just in the foyer, and also I'd like to invite you to thank Irene again for a fabulous talk.
Thank you.